The morning was quiet, but tension hung in the air like fog not yet burned away. Sunlight broke through the trees in sharp, deliberate lines, just like her steps. She walked with calm, not caution. But the officer who stopped her wasn't looking to listen. He saw what he wanted to see, a woman alone, silent, out of place. And in 10 careless seconds, he made the kind of mistake you don't walk away from. No warning, no patience, just a hand on his holster and a tone full of authority. But the woman before him wasn't lost. She wasn't weak. She was a federal judge watching him unravel. He thought he had control. He thought she'd stay quiet. He thought wrong. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? On that morning, the air felt thinner than usual, as if the sky had exhaled just enough to make space for something unspoken. The trail that curved behind the gated homes was quiet, save for the soft shuffle of leaves underfoot and the distant hiss of a sprinkler sputtering to life. Clarice Whitman walked slowly, not from weakness but from intention, a rhythm formed over years of walking alone in spaces not always built for her. The tip of her cane-black lacquered wood, with a silver head, tapped gently on the pavement, matching the quiet percussion of her steps. Her coat, dark navy with a tailored belt at the waist, moved in subtle waves behind her, brushing just above her boots with each stride. She knew this trail. She had traced it through every season, memorized the way the morning light pierced the canopy at the first bend, and how the shadows leaned just right after the rain. This wasn't just a path, it was a ritual, a way to reset the mind, to sort memory from noise, and to remind herself she still moved by her own volition. Her breath was steady, visible only in the brief puffs of spring chill that hadn't quite surrendered to the sun yet. She heard a bird trill from the oak above, and allowed herself the smallest smile. Not everything beautiful needs an audience, she thought, but the weight of watching returned before she even reached the gravel turn. It wasn't paranoia. Clarice had long learned the difference between fear and instinct. Behind her, low and quiet, came the familiar hum of an idling engine, too low to be casual, too patient to be accidental. She didn't stop, but her right hand adjusted slightly on the cane, not for support but for grounding. She didn't look back, not yet. Instead, she focused on the sound of her own steps, stretching each one like a metronome in a room full of static. When the headlights flicked on behind her, she didn't flinch, but her pulse noted the shift. The light didn't flash with urgency, it hovered like a question already forming its answer. Then came the voice, sharp-clipped and too loud for the stillness of the trail. "Excuse me, ma'am," it said, laced with an authority that mistook interruption for protocol. "You mind telling me where you're headed this morning?" Clarice stopped walking but didn't turn. The silence between her spine and the voice was deliberate. After a breath, she answered without lifting her chin. "I walk here every Tuesday, officer." Her voice was even low and calm, the kind of calm that unsettles people who expect compliance to arrive with apology. There was a pause, the kind that stretches not from confusion but from calculation. "I don't believe I've seen you here before," the officer said this time, stepping out of the vehicle. The sound of his boots meeting the ground cut through the birdsong like gravel thrown into water. Clarice still didn't turn, but the cane now rested firmly in her left hand. The sound of his approach was steady, purposeful, and slow, as if he was approaching a suspect instead of a senior woman in a wool coat. "Do you live in this neighborhood?" he asked, though his tone made it clear it wasn't a question but a screening. Now she turned smoothly, her shoulders square, eyes still half-shaded by the brim of her hat. She looked at him not with confrontation, but with measured presence. "Does that change the rules of the trail?" she asked. Her voice carried just enough weight to shift the air, but not enough to echo. He frowned just barely, as if her lack of fear hadn't matched the script he carried in his head. He took another step forward, hands on his belt posture, trained to suggest patience but radiating control. "I need to see some identification, ma'am," he said a little louder this time, as if clarity could cover discomfort. Clarice's breath was still even, but her eyes narrowed just slightly, as if studying the moment the way one studies a tremor before an earthquake. "You haven't told me what law I've broken," she said gently. "I've walked a public trail during daylight with no trespassing signs and no restrictions." Her words weren't confrontational, they were careful, each syllable placed like a chess piece. The officer shifted his stance. The body language changed just enough to make the space between them feel smaller. From his chest, a body camera blinked faintly, the red light more a prop than a promise. Clarice saw it. She'd seen many like it, worn like a shield, used like an excuse. Her fingers didn't tremble. Instead, she reached slowly into the inside of her coat. "You want ID," she said, her voice steady. "I'll show you mine if you'll explain the reason for the stop." There was no rush in her movement, no provocation. Just control, absolute and composed. She produced a small black wallet and unfolded it with the care of someone used to showing authority, not proving identity. What emerged wasn't a driver's license, but a badge, small metal engraved, worn in just the right places. The officer blinked, took a breath, and leaned in slightly. "What is this?" he asked, his voice uncertain for the first time. Clarice held the badge firm, let it catch the light, and met his gaze without blinking. "It's who I was," she said, "and depending on how this morning goes, it might still be who I am." He didn't respond, not right away. Something behind his eyes shifted, recognition without certainty, memory brushing against something filed too far back. She watched it settle in him, quiet and undeniable. The morning, which had once been filled with birdsong and distant sprinklers, now seemed suspended, held between the weight of a badge and the silence of a man who didn't realize who he was speaking to until it was almost too late. The officer's steps were slow, calculated, not out of caution, but from the practiced pacing of someone who believed the uniform he wore entitled him to curiosity that didn't need to be earned. Clarice watched his approach with the stillness of someone who had learned long ago that some situations escalate not because of chaos, but because of quiet intentions that choose the wrong target. His boots sank slightly into the softened trail edge, the rubber soles scuffing the crushed stone, and the sound of his belt buckle shifting under his weight was far too loud for the quiet of the woods. He stopped about 3 feet from her hands, resting just above his utility belt, elbows slightly flared, not in threat, but in posture, the kind that says, "I'm in control and I expect answers now." Clarice didn't move. She let the moment hang, let the silence stretch just long enough to remind him that her presence wasn't an accident, and that his assumptions might cost more than time. Her gaze didn't narrow and her face didn't harden, it remained composed, studied like a teacher waiting for a student to realize the lesson had already started. A breeze slipped through the trees above, rustling the leaves in a soft cascade, but the officer didn't seem to hear it. He only saw her, and in his eyes it was clear that he still hadn't recalibrated what he thought this encounter would be. "I asked to see your ID," he repeated this time, quieter but not softer, as if the volume drop could pass for reasonableness. Clarice tilted her head slightly more out of curiosity than response, and then took a breath slow, and measured the kind you take when you know you're being tested for something you didn't sign up for. "And I asked," she said calmly, "what law I've broken that would require me to surrender it." Her words weren't defiant, they were simply firm, laced with the tone of someone who knew the rules by heart and wasn't interested in playing pretend. The officer's jaw twitched. It was a small thing, the kind of motion that wouldn't register in a report, but it said everything about the shift in his expectations. "You're on a public trail," he said, "but this area's had a few incidents lately. People don't recognize you. Neighbors have concerns." Clarice didn't laugh. She didn't scoff or roll her eyes. She simply nodded once, as if acknowledging the script he was now trying to hide behind. "And what exactly," she asked, "does my face have to do with their concern?" That landed harder than anything else had so far. The officer blinked once, twice, and for a moment looked away, not far, just to the side, like a reflex that hadn't caught up to his intention. When he looked back at her, the tone had shifted again, less official, more defensive, as if her calmness had thrown off the rhythm he had been trained to control. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am," he said. Clarice's voice was steady when she replied, "Then do it properly." She reached into her coat again, same pace, same rhythm, and withdrew the same black leather wallet she had shown before. This time she opened it wider, letting the morning light reflect more clearly off the embossed emblem on the inner flap. She held it at chest height, not up in defiance, not out in surrender, but exactly where it needed to be seen. His eyes dropped to the card, and for a second too long he didn't speak. Something in the embossed text caught him, and he leaned forward, slightly, lips parting, then closing again without a word. The forest held still around them, the soundscape reduced to breath and breeze, and the subtle hum of discomfort beginning to rise inside him. "You with law enforcement?" he asked slowly, his voice sounding suddenly younger, like a rookie asking questions he wasn't sure he wanted the answers to. "I was," Clarice answered, then added, "I'm still cleared under state appointment if that matters to you." He cleared his throat. "You could have just said that." "No," she said, not unkindly, "you could have just asked without assuming something was wrong." That was the moment his posture faltered, not in collapse but in the way his weight shifted unevenly between his feet, like he'd suddenly noticed how visible his presence had become. Behind them, the patrol car's lights were still flashing, but now they felt less like authority and more like exposure. He turned slightly, reached for the remote on his vest, and silenced the bar, the red and blue reflection cutting out mid-spin. For a second, everything was still again, no flashing lights, no raised voices, just two people standing on a quiet trail, separated by uniform and history. Clarice let him linger in that silence, not because she needed him to feel small, but because some lessons can only be learned when the noise fades. She looked at him not with anger or pity, but with the kind of restrained disappointment that only comes from having seen the pattern too many times before. "What's your name?" she asked suddenly, not sharp, just curious. The officer straightened again out of instinct, like the question caught him off guard. "Colburn," he said. "Officer Dean Colburn." Clarice nodded. "Thank you." Then she took one step forward, not to close the distance, but to resume her walk. He didn't move right away. He stood there watching her, his mouth opening, as if to say something more, but no words came. Clarice didn't look back. Her cane tapped gently as she continued down the trail, the rhythm unchanged, the posture intact. The moment hadn't rattled her. It had clarified everything. Behind her, Officer Colburn remained still, one hand near his radio, the other slowly curling back to his side. And in that stillness, for the first time since he stepped out of the cruiser, he looked less like a man on duty and more like someone standing on the edge of a mistake he hadn't realized he'd already made. Clarice didn't walk far before the air behind her shifted again, just slightly, like tension moving through leaves rather than wind. She heard the sound of footsteps, catching up slower than before, but purposeful, no longer the stride of a man enforcing authority, but of one trying to reclaim something, slipping quietly from his grasp. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. The rhythm of his approach told her everything she needed to know. There was no emergency in his pace, no urgency in his breath, just that subtle stubbornness of someone who didn't like the feeling of not being in charge, not even for a minute. "Ma'am," he called again, his tone flatter, now stripped of performance, as if unsure what part he was supposed to play next. Clarice slowed her steps, and turned around with a smoothness that came not from submission, but from long familiarity with moments exactly like this one. She faced him squarely again, her hands relaxed at her sides, the cane now resting gently along her left leg like punctuation, not armor. Her eyes held no fire, but they held form, firm, focused, and too steady to be dismissed. Officer Colburn stopped a few feet away, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to retreat. His fingers grazed the front of his vest, like he was trying to feel the weight of the badge again, as if touching it might remind him where his footing had gone. "I'm still gonna need to take a closer look at that ID," he said, and though his voice aimed for authority, it landed somewhere between request and excuse. Clarice raised an eyebrow slow and measured the kind of gesture that doesn't need words to make a point. "Is that a question, officer?" she asked, her tone not mocking but clear, as if reminding him that every word now mattered more than he realized. He opened his mouth, then paused, chewing on the silence like it might give him something stronger to hold on to. "It's just," he began, "these days. You know, with all the fake credentials going around, people say they're with the state, with federal offices. Hard to tell who's real anymore." Clarice let the silence linger before answering, her voice smooth like a stone in slow water. "You'll find, Officer Colburn, that the people who fake power rarely carry themselves like they've earned it." She held the badge out again, same careful angle, same calm exposure. The metal gleamed softly in the muted daylight, not polished for show but simply maintained, used, not flaunted. He leaned in a little closer, this time squinting at the seal, trying to make sense of something his instincts hadn't prepared him for. "You say this is real?" he asked, quieter now, almost to himself. Clarice didn't blink. "It was signed and issued by the Attorney General's office 12 years ago," she said. "It's been renewed 3 times since." She let that sit between them like an open file folder on a cold desk, the kind with only one name at the top. Colburn stepped back just slightly and scratched the side of his neck like something itched that he couldn't explain. There was a long pause then, not awkward, but heavy, like both of them knew the conversation had already passed the point of formality and now lived in the space where pride wrestled with realization. Birds continued to chirp overhead, the high branches swaying gently as if untouched by the standoff below. A jogger passed in the distance, earbuds in, unaware of the moment unfolding just off the path. Colburn finally looked up from the badge and into her eyes, and for the first time she saw something different behind them, something unsettled, not hostile, but questioning. "You really carry this with you on walks?" he asked. And the way he said it revealed more than he meant to. It wasn't just curiosity, it was disbelief that someone like her would need to. Clarice tilted her head slightly, offering a thin, tired smile. "Experience has taught me that justice doesn't always recognize its own," she said. "So I carry what helps remind it." That landed harder than any raised voice ever could. It wasn't dramatic, it was just true. And truth, when said quietly, carries further. He stood there, not speaking, arms slightly apart, as if unsure where to place his hands. His gaze dropped once more to the badge, then to the path beneath them, and when he looked up again, his voice was lower, almost hesitant. "You must have dealt with a lot," he said. Clarice didn't respond right away. Her eyes searched his face, not to judge, but to decide if it was worth answering. After a moment she said, "We all carry something. The difference is whether we let it make us smaller or sharper." Then she turned calmly and resumed her walk. The cane tapped once against the trail, then again, and the rhythm picked up like a steady beat, returning to tempo. Behind her she heard nothing for a long time, not retreat, not pursuit, just the hush of a man left with the quiet echo of his own miscalculation. She didn't rush, didn't glance back, didn't indulge the part of her that wanted confirmation of change. Instead, she focused forward, breathing in the scent of cedar and damp leaves, each step a statement not of escape but of sovereignty. She knew he'd follow or he wouldn't. Either way, the conversation was no longer about her. It was about the space she refused to surrender and the silence she refused to fill for anyone else's comfort. Clarice didn't walk faster. She walked truer, and that she knew was more dangerous to a man like Colburn than anything she might have said out loud. Clarice didn't expect the officer to let it go, not really, because men like Colburn rarely walked away from confusion without trying to reshape it into control. She could feel his presence lingering behind her like a second shadow, not menacing, not loud, but persistent, in that way people get when the narrative they've written in their heads begins to slip out of their hands. She didn't quicken her pace or change her posture. She walked with the same slow rhythm she always did, letting the tip of her cane strike the ground with the kind of assurance that wasn't loud, but left no room for doubt. The trail curved gently to the left, and when she reached the wooden footbridge that crossed a shallow stream, she paused, letting her hand rest lightly on the railing, not because she needed the support, but because some moments call for stillness, not momentum. Behind her, gravel shifted, and then a voice returned, slower, now almost cautious, but still carrying the undercurrent of someone who believed he deserved answers. "Ma'am," Colburn said again, "you really seem like you know who I am." Clarice turned slightly, just enough to catch his eyes without giving him the full attention he wanted. She didn't speak right away. She let him sit in that space for a second, let him hear how loud silence can become when you're suddenly unsure of yourself. "I don't know you personally," she said finally, her voice low, smooth, deliberate, "but I've seen your name before." His head tilted, his expression tightening into something between confusion and defense. And then he stepped a little closer, hands still resting on his belt, but his fingers now visibly flexing like they were looking for something to hold onto. "I've never had any run-ins with anyone like you," he said, trying to sound firm, but landing somewhere just shy of defensive. Clarice gave him a long look, then one that didn't challenge him outright, but examined him like a file already halfway open. "You were the arresting officer in a case I reviewed nearly 3 years ago," she said quietly, almost gently, like she was lifting a box of old papers she hadn't wanted to revisit, but knew she must. The boy's name was Jacob Morrow, 17. No weapon, no priors. Just a hoodie, and a question you didn't feel like answering. Colburn froze, not all at once, but in pieces, a slight shift in his shoulders, a blink that came too late, a breath that caught just before it reached his lungs. Clarice saw it, noted it, and continued anyway because she wasn't here to spare him. "You tackled him face first into the sidewalk outside his uncle's house," she said, her voice now threaded with something colder than anger clarity. "Fractured his cheekbone, damaged 2 vertebrae, wrote it up as non-compliant behavior and refusal to follow verbal command." Colburn took a full step back now, as if trying to physically distance himself from the words, from the weight they suddenly carried in the open air. "That case was reviewed," he said, and the way he said it wasn't confident, it was rehearsed, pulled from a drawer of lines he'd used before, hoping they'd hold up one more time. "Reviewed by your own department," Clarice replied, still calm, still steady. "Your partner's statement was never taken. The body cam malfunctioned. The footage from the convenience store across the street was unavailable due to data retention limitations." She watched him swallow, not dramatically, but visibly, like the truth had found its way into his throat and settled there. "I was cleared," he said again, more quietly now, almost as if hoping that saying it softer might make it more believable. "You weren't cleared," she said, and her voice didn't rise, but it sharpened like a blade set gently on a table. "You were protected. There's a difference." The breeze picked up slightly around them, rustling through the trees, lifting the hem of her coat, just enough to reveal the faint outline of a folded paper tucked into the inside pocket. She made no move to show it, but its presence hung in the space between them like a sealed verdict. Colburn looked down at the ground, then back at her, and for the first time he didn't look like an officer evaluating a situation. He looked like a man remembering something he'd hoped would stay buried. "Why are you bringing this up now?" he asked, his voice thinner than before. Clarice took a breath, not because she was tired, but because she wanted her next words to land exactly where they needed to. "Because you don't get to walk behind me on this trail," she said, carrying a badge like nothing happened while the families you scarred still don't have a clear answer about why a simple question turned into a broken jaw. She paused, then added more quietly, "Because sometimes the weight of what we walk past has a way of finding us again." Colburn didn't reply. His eyes flicked toward her coat, then back to her face, and Clarice saw something shift, not guilt, not yet, but the beginning of awareness, the edges of a carefully managed story starting to fray. She didn't need to press further. She didn't need him to confess. The silence between them was already doing that work. Instead, she stepped forward, walking past him without hesitation, her cane clicking once on the wooden slats of the bridge, then again on the gravel path beyond. He didn't move to stop her this time. He just stood there, arms at his sides, the badge on his chest, catching the light in a way that made it look suddenly unfamiliar, less like authority, more like a question he didn't know how to answer anymore. Clarice felt the wind shift slightly as she continued down the path, not against her, not with her, but around her, like the air itself had decided to clear the way. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. Whatever needed to be said had already arrived quietly in the spaces between memory and denial. And as the trees opened up ahead, casting her figure into longer light, she allowed herself a breath, not relief, not victory, just breath. Because sometimes that's all justice, is a quiet moment reclaimed in the middle of someone else's unfinished story. Colburn didn't move right away, not because he was frozen in fear, but because something deeper had begun to dislodge inside him, something that had been resting too comfortably beneath years of practiced certainty and departmental protection. Clarice's words hadn't struck him like an accusation. They had seeped into the cracks of a narrative he'd told himself so many times that he had almost started to believe it was truth. Now, standing alone on that gravel path as she walked further down the trail without looking back, he found his fingers twitching near his utility belt, not from instinct but from a strange emptiness, a kind of displacement that comes when you suddenly realize the uniform on your chest might no longer protect you from the memory it's meant to defend. He turned slightly, watching her silhouette shrink against the backdrop of early spring trees, and for a flickering second he felt like he was watching a verdict leave the courtroom before the gavel ever dropped. The light had changed to less warm, more diffused, filtered through a thin haze of doubt he hadn't noticed forming until it settled into the corners of his vision. The gravel beneath his boots didn't feel as steady now, and the weight of his radio, his badge, even the harmless clipboard in his cruiser, they all felt like props in a performance that had lost its audience. Clarice, for her part, didn't expect him to follow again, though she wasn't surprised when she heard his footsteps return behind her, softer this time, like a man not sure whether he was chasing the moment or apologizing to it. She didn't turn around immediately. She let him walk close enough for the space between them to feel familiar, then paused at the edge of a break in the trail where the trees opened up to a narrow view of the adjacent rooftops. She stood there without speaking, letting the silence breathe until he stepped beside her. "You said that name like it still weighs something," he said, not unkindly but with the hesitance of someone trying to step carefully through their own memory. "It should," she answered, her gaze still fixed ahead, not on the homes but on something just beyond them, something only she could see. "That boy never got to walk away from what you did. The least you can do is carry the truth of it." Colburn exhaled sharp and shallow, the kind of breath you take when denial doesn't fit anymore, but guilt hasn't quite taken its place. "I was following protocol," he said quietly, the words sounding more like a question than a defense. He reached for his pocket. "I didn't know what he had." Clarice turned now slowly, and met his eyes not to accuse, but to hold him in a gaze that didn't flinch, didn't soften, and didn't offer an escape. "And you still don't," she said. "Because the file said he had nothing. No weapon. Just a phone and a wallet. You said, non-compliant. The paramedic report said unconscious before backup arrived." His jaw tightened not out of aggression, but because the words scraped against something he had filed away in a locked drawer he never meant to open again. "That case was never supposed to go higher than internal affairs," he muttered mostly to himself. "But it did," Clarice replied, "because someone submitted a duplicate report through an outside channel. Someone who thought the system might choke on the truth if it was fed too fast." She shifted her stance slightly, the silver tip of her cane tapping once against a flat stone beside her boot. "That someone was me." Colburn blinked once, twice, as if trying to process that the woman in front of him, calm, measured, unshaken, had been the quiet storm that stirred the entire review into motion. "You were behind that?" he asked, incredulous, but not angry, just disoriented like he was seeing her for the first time in full color. "I was," she said, "but the system wasn't ready to listen then. They buried it. Moved your partner to a new precinct. Lost the original footage. Asked me to reconsider my findings for the sake of morale." Her voice didn't rise. If anything, it grew steadier with each word, like she was recounting something rehearsed, not for drama but for documentation. "They said I was making too much noise over a kid who couldn't testify." Colburn looked away again, his jaw working like he was chewing regret but hadn't yet found the courage to swallow it. The sound of a lawn mower buzzed faintly in the distance, and a wind chime from one of the nearby porches stirred just enough to punctuate the silence with something soft and incongruous. Clarice watched him process the memory, the realization, the fracture of the image he'd tried to preserve. "I didn't mean to hurt him," he said finally, and the words came out flat, thin, but real, in a way that couldn't be dressed up. "I thought he stopped there, like the end of the sentence had dried up before it could escape." Clarice didn't move. She let him sit in that half-formed admission because it wasn't her job to fill in what he hadn't finished. "Intent doesn't erase impact," she said, "and memory doesn't vanish just because paperwork says it should." They stood there together, not as adversaries, not quite as allies, but as two people now occupying the same truth in different ways. The badge on his chest no longer gleamed the way it had in the filtered sunlight. It looked smaller, somehow less like a symbol, and more like a question mark that had been polished for too long. She turned again, resuming her walk without fanfare, her cane meeting the earth with the same confident rhythm. Behind her, Colburn stayed still, watching not out of suspicion, but because the moment had stripped away everything but the truth. And sometimes truth doesn't need to scream to shake the ground. As Clarice walked further down the trail, the canopy above opened wider, the breeze picked up slightly, and the light that filtered through the trees felt cleaner, less filtered by doubt. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. But her shoulders lifted a little, not from pride, but from the quiet, steady relief of knowing that sometimes, even when the system tries to forget, someone still remembers exactly where the file was buried and has the patience to dig it up. The sun had risen higher by the time Clarice reached the bend in the trail where the trees thinned and the gravel brightened, and though the air was still cool, there was a quiet shift in the atmosphere, as if the weight of everything left unspoken was finally beginning to gather shape in the space between them. She didn't need to look back to know Colburn was still there, a few steps behind her now, not closing the distance but not willing to let it widen either. She could feel his uncertainty brushing against her like a branch reaching across the path uninvited but not entirely hostile. The silence between them wasn't heavy with tension anymore. It was heavy with realization, the kind that doesn't arrive with noise but with a slow awareness that something you thought was buried still has a pulse. Clarice stopped at a small clearing where a bench sat beneath a twisted elm tree, its roots coiled like questions left unanswered. She placed her hand on the backrest, then sat slowly, not out of fatigue but to mark the moment, because some truths deserve to be spoken while seated, grounded, and unhurried. The wind moved through the trees above her, like a memory being stirred, and for a long moment she simply listened to it, letting the sound of rustling branches fill the spaces that neither of them had quite found the words for yet. Colburn remained standing a few feet away, arms crossed tightly against his chest, eyes scanning the horizon like he hoped the day might swallow everything that had just passed. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, then cleared his throat not to speak, but to test if his voice still belonged in the conversation. Clarice glanced at him, her expression unreadable, and then looked forward again, her cane resting beside her like a witness. "You think I should have lost everything back then," he said finally, his voice flat like he was trying to convince himself of the statement as he said it. Clarice didn't turn her head, but her voice came steady. "I think you never should have been given it back without reckoning with what you did." Her words weren't harsh, but they carried the quiet finality of someone who'd reviewed enough closed files to know which ones had been shut too soon. Colburn exhaled through his nose, long and slow, and the sound carried more frustration than reflection. "There are a lot of us who've made mistakes," he muttered. "They don't all get reopened like this." "That's true," Clarice replied, "but not all of them leave a boy on a stretcher and a community wondering why silence moved faster than justice." She turned to face him now, her eyes calm but sharp, and for the first time since the conversation began, she allowed him to see the weight behind her words. Not just legal, but personal. "You think this is about punishing you," she said, "but it's not. It's about reminding the system that forgetting isn't the same as healing." Colburn didn't respond. He looked down at the ground, kicking a loose pebble with the toe of his boot, as if hoping that small disruption might distract from the larger one unraveling in his mind. Clarice watched him study the angle of his shoulders, the slow collapse of posture that comes not from exhaustion but from recognition. She let him sit in it, let him feel the way silence shifts when it no longer serves as shelter but becomes a mirror. Then, with the kind of composure that made every word land like a verdict, she reached into the inside pocket of her coat and pulled out a plain, cream-colored envelope. She didn't wave it, she didn't threaten with it. She simply laid it flat across her knees, her palm resting lightly on its surface, as if to keep it from lifting in the breeze. The embossed seal on the flap was visible but understated, official, not theatrical. Colburn's eyes locked onto it and the moment stretched. He didn't ask what it was. He already knew. "You're reopening the case," he said quietly, and this time there was no defiance in his tone, only inevitability. Clarice gave a small nod. "It's not just about your actions, officer. It's about the process that let them fade into a file drawer without consequence." She lifted the envelope slightly and turned it toward him. "This was submitted last week, not by anger, but by principle." Colburn stepped forward, not to grab it, but to see it more clearly, and Clarice held it steady. He squinted, reading the line typed just beneath the state seal, and his lips moved as he mouthed the name printed in bold, Jacob Morrow. There was no accompanying image, no dramatic summary, just the facts, just the framework for a process long delayed. "I didn't think anyone was still watching," he said, almost to himself. Clarice's response came soft but unflinching. "That's the danger, Dean. You thought silence meant closure. It didn't. It just meant someone was waiting for the right moment to speak." The breeze picked up again, stronger this time, lifting the edge of the envelope before she pressed it back down. Colburn stared at her for a long moment, then dropped his gaze to the ground again. His voice came quieter now, almost uncertain. "What do you want from me?" Clarice leaned back slightly, folding her hands over the envelope with a quiet steadiness that said she had waited years to answer that question. "I don't want anything from you," she said. "What I want is for the truth to walk back into the room and stay there until people can breathe around it again." She paused, then added, "And if that means you have to carry it a while, so be it." He nodded slowly, his jaw tight, but his stance no longer combative. He didn't say another word, and he didn't have to. The silence between them had changed again, not heavy now, but purposeful, like a room finally cleared of excuses. Clarice stood, tucked the envelope back into her coat, and straightened with that same quiet dignity that had carried her through years of courtrooms, hearings, and unwelcomed resistance. She turned toward the path, gave him one final look, not a challenge, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement, and then walked on each step, carrying the weight of history, but never bending under it. Behind her, Officer Colburn remained by the bench, watching, listening to the wind, and realizing perhaps for the first time what accountability actually sounds like when it arrives without rage, but refuses to leave without answers. The path narrowed again, as Clarice continued forward, the sunlight filtering through the canopy above, like an old promise slowly being fulfilled. Each step she took was deliberate, not with the stiffness of age, but with the patience of someone who understood that some things, truth, justice, reckoning, only arrive when you stop rushing to meet them and simply wait in the right place. Her cane struck the trail in a steady rhythm, the quiet knock of its metal tip a constant reminder of how far she had come, not just today, but across years of being doubted, dismissed, or politely ignored. She wasn't walking to reach a destination now. She was walking to deliver a truth that had been prepared, protected, and timed with care. Colburn followed from a distance, not quite beside her anymore, but close enough that his presence trailed like an echo of something undone. He hadn't said much since the envelope appeared, hadn't tried to defend himself again or justify what had been written in reports under his name. Something had shifted in him the way things shift when denial gives way to an unsettling possibility that someone had been watching, recording, remembering long after the world thought the story had ended. Clarice paused at the edge of a clearing where the trail widened into a brief stretch of open dirt flanked by tall grass and wild sumac. She turned slightly toward him, not facing him fully, but enough that her voice carried cleanly through the still air. "I didn't come out here just to walk," she said, her tone even quiet, but unmistakably resolved. "You were never an accident, Dean. You were scheduled." His eyes narrowed, and he took half a step forward before stopping again, arms folding across his chest, more from instinct than confidence. "Scheduled," he repeated like the word didn't quite fit into the framework of how he thought mornings like this were supposed to unfold. Clarice nodded once, and her hand moved slowly inside her coat again, withdrawing the envelope not to flash it like a weapon, but to set it firmly in the space between them, as a physical truth that no longer required explanation. "I've been tracking your reinstatement since the day it was filed," she said. "Every document, every signature, every name that pushed it through the system without review." She didn't say it with bitterness. She said it like a record being read aloud in court, factual, unflinching with weight, not because of volume but because of precision. "And this," she added, tapping the envelope gently with the tip of her gloved finger, "isn't just a summons. It's the opening note of a hearing that should have happened 3 years ago." Colburn didn't speak, but his face told a different story, one of shock tightening into something close to dread, a narrowing of the eyes, a faint tremble in the jaw. He looked down at the envelope, then back at her, like the distance between what he remembered and what she held in her hand had suddenly collapsed into a single point of no return. "You set me up," he said, and though the words came out flat, they hung in the air like smoke from a match already burned. "No," Clarice replied gently but with unmistakable edge. "I followed your paperwork while you counted on it disappearing." She let that settle for a beat before continuing. "You weren't targeted, Dean. You were documented." A breeze passed between them, then tugging at the edges of the envelope, and Clarice adjusted her grip slightly, anchoring it with her palm. In the distance, a dog barked once, and somewhere deeper in the woods, the echo of wind moved through a stand of pines, like the faint roar of memory surfacing. Colburn rubbed the back of his neck with his hand, not out of discomfort, but like a man trying to hold his thoughts in place before they scattered too far to catch. "I didn't expect," he started, but the words faltered under their own weight, as if the rest of the sentence had collapsed under the strain of what was now undeniably real. Clarice stepped forward, not aggressively, not even assertively, but with the quiet grace of someone placing something back where it belonged. She extended the envelope to him, her fingers steady, her eyes calm. "You'll want to read this in private," she said. "But make no mistake, it doesn't just bear your name. It carries the names of those who didn't survive your silence." He took it slowly, his hand brushing against hers in a moment that felt more like transition than transaction. His grip tightened as he looked at the seal, and for a long second he didn't move, didn't speak. Just stood there holding a paper that weighed more than any weapon he'd ever been issued. "What happens now?" he asked finally, his voice low, stripped of defiance. Clarice took a breath before answering. "Now you show up, you testify, and you listen to the parts of the story you were never asked to tell." Her words weren't cruel. They were clean the way truth feels when it's finally unwrapped after being kept in the dark too long. Colburn looked down again, eyes scanning the envelope like it might somehow rewrite itself if he stared long enough. But the text didn't change. The seal didn't blur. His name, typed and bolded in the upper right corner, remained fixed, like a door that had finally been kicked open. Clarice turned away without waiting for a reply because she wasn't there to negotiate. She had done what she came to do, not to punish, not to provoke, but to restore the order that had been broken by omission and protected by protocol. Her cane struck the trail again as she walked, the sound clear, steady, final. Behind her, Colburn didn't move for a long time. And when he finally did, it wasn't with the weight of authority, but with the burden of exposure, the kind that doesn't scream, doesn't run, doesn't rage, but lingers whispering at every step someone was watching, and now someone remembers. By the time Officer Dean Colburn returned to the station later that afternoon, the world around him hadn't changed, but something inside him had shifted in a way that made the familiar feel suddenly unstable. The long hallway that had always seemed neutral and gray, just linoleum fluorescent light, and the low murmur of officers talking near the front desk, now pressed in on him with a quiet tension he couldn't quite name. He walked a little slower than usual, his boots clicking on the tile with less certainty, the envelope still tucked under his arm like a weight he couldn't quite carry out of sight. His badge still gleamed on his chest, polished that morning, like it mattered. But it no longer felt like armor. It felt like an open question waiting for an answer he wasn't sure he could give. The front desk sergeant barely looked up as Dean signed back in from patrol, but the silence that followed carried more than routine. There was a pause in the air, not an accusation, not yet, but a kind of held breath, as if the building itself knew something was about to shift. Dean offered a quick nod, muttered something about finishing his route early, and slipped down the hall toward his desk, hoping for a moment to regroup, to put down the envelope, to think. But halfway there, a voice stopped him, low, firm, familiar. "Colburn," said Captain Marsden from behind the glass of his office, the door already cracked open like an invitation to a conversation Dean didn't want to have. "Step inside." Dean hesitated only a second before complying, adjusting his shoulders as he entered, trying to remember how he usually carried himself in that room. The captain didn't look up right away. He sat behind his desk, with a folder open in front of him, flipping slowly through a handful of documents, his finger tapping the top page with a steady, quiet rhythm. When he finally met Dean's eyes, the look wasn't angry, it was worse, it was measured. "We've received a copy," Marsden said, tapping the folder again, "of the federal inquiry." Dean didn't respond. He knew which folder. He had felt it breathing against his side since Clarice had handed it to him on the trail, since the weight of it had replaced every assumption he had about how that morning would go. "There's body cam footage included," the captain continued, his voice level not raised. "Yours partially obscured. Discrepancies in the original report. The names of 2 witnesses never interviewed. A video taken from a traffic camera we weren't told existed." He let the silence fall for a beat, then added, "And a reinstatement order processed through 3 offices without oversight." Dean finally cleared his throat, trying to summon something, an explanation, a defense, a version of the story he could still live with. "Captain, I didn't request the reinstatement. It just came through." Marsden didn't flinch. "No one's saying you forged it, but someone moved your file fast enough that it avoided full review. And now, he closed the folder gently like one closes a door. Now the people who did that are under scrutiny, and so are you. Dean shifted in his seat, suddenly aware of the tightness in his collar, the dryness in his mouth, the way his badge seemed to reflect the light back at him, rather than out toward the room. This wasn't supposed to come back, he said, and the moment he said it, he knew how it sounded like truth and confession had just shaken hands behind his teeth. No, Marsden said calmly, it wasn't, but now it has. There was another pause, not as long, but heavier. Then the captain leaned forward, elbows on his desk, fingers interlocked. You have the right to counsel. You're not under arrest. Yet, but federal investigators will be arriving this week to collect all documentation related to the Jacob Morrow case, your suspension, your reinstatement, and your field conduct since returning to duty. Dean nodded once because it was the only movement left to him that didn't feel like collapse. He didn't ask who submitted the file. He didn't need to. He had seen it in Clarice's eyes, that calm, unshaken resolve that doesn't fight for noise, but settles in the bones like a verdict waiting to land. She was on that panel, Dean said, more to himself than to the captain. She read my file. Marsden's gaze didn't change. She didn't forget. For a long time, neither man said anything. Outside, the afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the parking lot, but inside the office, the light remained sharp, sterile, unwavering. Dean could feel it on the back of his neck like heat that didn't belong to the season. His hands remained on his knees, steady in appearance, but his fingertips tapped ever so slightly, just enough to betray the current running underneath. She said I was scheduled, Dean whispered, like the words had followed him into every corner since they were first spoken. That this wasn't coincidence. Marsden leaned back in his chair and studied him for a long moment. Sometimes justice moves quiet, he said. Until it doesn't. Dean stood slower than he meant to, nodding, not as agreement but acknowledgement. Do I keep working, he asked, though even as he said it he could feel the answer already forming, like fog in the room. For now, Marsden replied. But don't schedule any patrols past Friday. Dean nodded again, then turned and left the office without another word. The hallway felt longer on the way out, like something had been added to the air, something heavier than policy, deeper than reputation. When he reached his locker, he set the envelope inside, but his hand lingered on it for a moment before letting go. It was still warm. Outside, he stepped into the daylight, blinking as the brightness caught him off guard, like he'd just stepped out of another version of himself, and didn't quite recognize the shape he'd left behind. The breeze that passed over the lot was light but not comforting. It carried something with it, something old, something named, and this time it didn't pass through him, it stayed. The story didn't break like a wave. It moved like a tide, creeping first into inboxes, then morning broadcasts, then community whispers passed between coffee mugs and grocery aisles. It didn't come with dramatic headlines or breaking news. Banners not at first, because truth rarely announces itself with fireworks. It settles in gradually reshaping the landscape, one honest sentence at a time. The federal inquiry into Officer Dean Colburn's reinstatement had barely been open for 72 hours when it began to ripple outward in ways no one could quite contain. Internal memos turned into questions during staff meetings. A quietly buried video file resurfaced online, uploaded anonymously, showing 12 seconds of grainy footage from a dashcam once thought erased. The name Jacob Morrow began appearing again on protest flyers, in classroom discussions, etched in sidewalk chalk outside a local community center where his cousins still went for after-school tutoring. Clarice didn't watch it unfold with satisfaction. She watched with stillness, because she knew too well that justice isn't a spectacle. It's a process of reminding people they saw something, even if they didn't want to admit it at the time. She kept to her schedule, walked her morning trail, as always greeted the birds and the breeze, with the same quiet ritual that had grounded her through courts, committees, and years of being the last voice in a room full of closed ears. But this time, as she walked, heads turned not in suspicion but in recognition, not for her name but for the quiet persistence of her presence. The neighborhood didn't change overnight, but it began to notice itself more, how silence had protected some, and how that silence was now being named. Local papers began running op-eds from people who had once looked away, from teachers who remembered Jacob's science fair project, from a woman who had seen the ambulance but convinced herself it was probably nothing serious. At the town hall meeting, where 10 people normally gathered to discuss speed bumps and noise ordinances, more than 50 showed up, standing in the back, arms folded, waiting to ask questions they hadn't had the language for until now. Dean saw it in their eyes too, not all of them hostile, but none of them unaware anymore. He walked into the department 2 days after the file had been officially unsealed and felt the air shift before anyone spoke a word. Officers nodded a little too tightly. Conversations paused as he passed. The break room emptied a little faster when he sat down. It wasn't confrontation, it was distance. A slow rearrangement of space and allegiance. He tried to keep his head down, finish the reports, stay away from the press. But the story had already grown legs, and people had started tracing its shape through more than just headlines. A retired clerk from the Internal Affairs Office came forward with an email chain showing that Jacob's file had been marked for low-priority review within 48 hours of the incident. An assistant district attorney submitted a sealed statement confirming she had flagged inconsistencies that never made it to court. One of the paramedics who responded that day spoke to a local journalist, voice disguised but clear enough to say he wasn't resisting, he was asking what he did wrong. Clarice read every piece with the same calm she'd carried through her conversation with Colburn on the trail, not because it didn't move her, but because she had already felt all of it before. Now she simply watched as others caught up. She didn't speak to the press, didn't issue statements, didn't comment on the accuracy of the reports. She let the evidence do what her voice never could stand without needing her presence beside it. At a corner cafe, someone printed Jacob's picture and taped it to the wall beside the menu beneath the words, "Not Forgotten." At a school assembly, a student asked, if he wasn't dangerous, why did they treat him like he was? And the teacher, who had once rushed past the news coverage to avoid discomfort, found herself answering, because some people were taught to be afraid of the wrong things. The room went quiet. A few students nodded. A few lowered their heads. Meanwhile, Dean sat at his desk, staring at a call sheet. He couldn't seem to finish the names and numbers blurring together like static. He hadn't spoken to his captain since the meeting hadn't spoken to anyone about the envelope still sitting unopened in his bottom drawer, its seal broken only in memory. The department hadn't suspended him, not yet, but he felt the shift. He felt it in the hesitation behind every handshake, in the way officers no longer asked if he was heading out on patrol, in the way even the radio static seemed more judgmental now. He thought about driving to Clarice's house, about saying something he didn't know what, but every time he put his hand on the keys it felt dishonest. Not because he wasn't sorry, but because he still didn't know whether he was sorry for what happened or sorry for being caught. Clarice didn't expect an apology. She didn't believe in them the way others did. She believed in change, in movement, in the slow unwinding of systems that had protected too many at the expense of the voiceless. She walked the trail the next day, as usual, nodding at the jogger who offered a quiet good morning and pausing near the bench where she'd handed over the envelope just days before. There was nothing dramatic about her pace, nothing new about the path, but the way people looked at her had shifted, not with awe, not even respect, but understanding. A woman walking her dog stopped and said, "I saw your name in the article." Clarice offered a polite nod. The woman continued, "I didn't know people could still care that much after all this time." Clarice didn't smile, but her voice was gentle. "Caring doesn't expire. Some of us just don't stop when the camera shuts off." The woman blinked, then nodded, and as she walked away, Clarice resumed her rhythm, the cane tapping like punctuation after every step. She wasn't walking to be seen. She never had. But now finally the world was learning how to look not at her, but at what she had never allowed them to forget. The hearing room wasn't built for spectacle. It was made of muted colors, recessed lighting, and walls that didn't echo, no matter how hard a truth bounced off them. There were no television cameras, no crowds outside holding signs, no dramatic music to swell when someone walked in. Just a heavy wooden table polished from years of elbows leaned into it, and chairs that creaked when people shifted from discomfort rather than drama. Clarice sat near the far end, her back straight but never stiff, hands folded loosely in her lap, not to appear calm, but because she was. She had waited for this, not out of revenge, not for attention, but because she believed that certain stories didn't close until someone stood up and said, "This is what happened. Let the record show we didn't look away." The Federal Oversight Panel sat across from her 4 people in navy suits and tired expressions, eyes trained to appear impartial, even as their pens clicked more often than they needed to. Behind them, a court reporter typed in the measured rhythm of someone who knew the difference between opinion and admission. And beside Clarice, a stack of folders rested quietly on the table. Neatly arranged corners aligned every page, time-stamped, reviewed, cross-referenced, not to overwhelm, but to remind everyone present that what she had brought wasn't accusation. It was evidence. When she spoke, her voice didn't try to fill the room. It didn't need to. Jacob Morrow was 17 years old. She began each syllable placed like a stone across a river she had crossed too many times in silence. He was walking home from his cousin's house. He had a phone, a wallet, and a question. Her eyes scanned the panel, not searching for sympathy, but making sure none of them looked away. He asked, "Why are you stopping me?" she continued, and for a moment her voice softened, not from emotion, but precision. That's what he said. That's what got recorded in a neighbor's cell phone clip. Not a threat. Not a refusal. Just a question. Across the room, someone cleared their throat, but Clarice didn't pause. She knew how easily discomfort could be mistaken for complexity. The responding officer, Dean Colburn, wrote, "Non-compliant, agitated, reached for waistband." But the footage didn't support that. The medical report didn't support that. And most of all, the timeline didn't support that. There was a 12-second window where the camera failed, the body cam tilted, and a young man's spine was fractured. One of the panelists leaned forward, interlocked fingers resting on a legal pad. "Miss Whitman," he said, tone level, "we're aware of the inconsistencies in the original report. What we'd like to understand is why this wasn't pursued through traditional disciplinary channels at the time." Clarice nodded, once already prepared. Because those channels were rerouted. Because the recommendation for external review was shelved by someone higher up, and the officer was quietly reassigned, then reinstated months later without proper audit. She reached down, lifted one folder from the pile and slid it gently toward the panel. "This is the waiver that approved his reinstatement. Note the lack of required signatures." The panelist flipped it open, eyes scanning quickly, then passing it to the person beside him. Clarice didn't press the moment. She didn't need to. The silence that followed did the work for her, settling over the room like truth finally allowed to breathe in. "Why pursue it now?" another panelist asked, her tone curious but wary. After all this time, Clarice's response came steady, unwavering. Because the time didn't erase what happened, it just delayed who had to answer for it. She let that hang before continuing. "This isn't about punishment. It's about procedure. It's about whether this system still means what it says in the mission statements on your website." There was no reaction. Just pens, moving pages, flipping eyes, avoiding hers for a moment longer than necessary. Outside, a low rumble of traffic pressed faintly through the walls, a sound so ordinary it felt out of place, in a room where so much had once been buried. Then the door opened behind her and Dean Colburn stepped in. He didn't come in defiant, not the way some expected. He walked with the hesitation of someone who had finally run out of places to retreat. His badge was still pinned to his chest, but even from where Clarice sat it looked dimmer than before, not tarnished, just uncertain. He sat across from the panel, nodded when addressed, and folded his hands on the table like a student unprepared for a question he'd avoided too long. When asked to speak, he didn't recite policy or quote from memory. He didn't use legal terms or departmental jargon. He simply looked at the panel, then at Clarice, and said, "I made a decision. I didn't know how to question at the time, and I never asked if that made it right." There was a stillness in the room that no transcript would capture, only breath and blinking, and the subtle weight of a man trying to find the shape of his own responsibility. Clarice didn't react. She didn't nod. She didn't flinch. Because this wasn't about watching him crumble. It was about watching the system finally stand still long enough to hear what it had ignored. The hearing adjourned after 97 minutes. No ruling, no conclusion. Just a list of follow-ups and a quiet confirmation that the process had been reopened, this time publicly, transparently, and without the benefit of forgetting. As Clarice gathered her things, a clerk passed her a note folded in half, written in uneven handwriting. It read, "Thank you for not letting his name disappear." She slipped it into her coat pocket without a word. Walking out of the building, the afternoon light fell across her face like a gentle weight she had grown used to carrying. People passed her on the sidewalk, talking into phones, sipping coffee, distracted by the noise of everyday life. But for just a moment, as she reached the steps, a young woman paused, looked up, and offered a small nod. Clarice returned it, and though they didn't speak, something passed between them, something that needed no translation. Justice, when it moves slowly, often arrives without applause. But when it stands still long enough to be heard, it changes everything, one breath at a time. The trail looked almost the same that morning, but Clarice could feel something different in the way the air met her skin, like the quiet itself had changed its meaning. The gravel under her boots still crunched with each measured step, and the tall sycamore trees still cast those same familiar shadows across the bend. But there was a softness in the silence, now one that didn't carry the weight of doubt or suspicion. She didn't rush. She never did. But this time each step carried a kind of ease she hadn't allowed herself to feel in weeks. The envelope was gone. The hearing had passed. The panel was reviewing the paperwork was public, and her role, at least in the eyes of procedure, was complete. And yet, as Clarice rounded the curve that led to the wooden bridge over the narrow stream, she felt no closure, no neat ending settling into place. Justice, she had long believed, wasn't a door you closed. It was a door you held open, even when your arm began to tremble. She paused at the foot of the bridge, resting one hand gently on the railing, letting her gaze wander across the trees swaying in the distance. The wind was light, fragrant with the scent of earth and blooming grass, and the morning sun filtered through the canopy in soft golden ribbons, lighting the trail like a path remembered. A child's voice called out somewhere up the hill, high and bright, chasing laughter, and moments later, a pair of young boys raced past on their bicycles, shouting playful challenges, the sound of rubber on dirt echoing between trees. One of them looked over his shoulder and caught sight of Clarice. He slowed, turned his handlebars just slightly, and coasted to a stop a few feet away. "Hey," he said, breathless but curious. "Are you the lady from the picture at the library?" Clarice tilted her head slightly, eyebrows raised. "What picture?" The boy shrugged, dropping one foot to the ground to steady himself. "There's a photo near the checkout desk. It's a woman in a blue coat holding a folder. Someone said she used to be a judge or something." Clarice gave a small, knowing smile. "Used to be," she said, nodding gently. "That's probably me." The boy grinned wide and open. "That's cool," he said, as if recognizing someone in history made them a little more real. His friend called from further down the path, and the boy turned his bike, giving her one last glance. "Thanks for whatever it is you did," he said, fumbling a bit, as kids do when trying to name something bigger than they can grasp. Clarice just nodded again, watching, as he pedaled off, his silhouette shrinking into the dappled morning light. She stood there for a moment longer, listening to the faint chorus of wind and distant voices, letting the scene settle in her chest, like a memory that had finally been allowed to breathe. She resumed walking her cane, tapping softly against the bridge as she crossed, and with each step she felt more rooted in the present, not just as a witness to what had happened, but as a quiet part of what might come next. The hearing had left its mark, not with punishment, but with presence. And that was the part people rarely understood, that sometimes just showing up, telling the truth, and refusing to look away could shift the course of things more than any ruling or headline ever could. She passed the bench again, the one where Dean Colburn had stood, hands, shaking eyes, lowered mouth, unable to find the words he thought would protect him. She didn't stop this time. She let it pass like a chapter already read, not erased, not forgotten, but fully turned. Her feet moved with quiet certainty, her posture as upright as it had been the day she handed over the envelope. There was no triumph in her stride, just clarity. Further down the trail, a woman in her 50s sat sipping coffee from a travel mug. A golden retriever curled at her feet. When she noticed Clarice, she lifted her hand in a subtle wave, not tentative, not performative, just a human gesture that said, "I see you." Clarice returned the wave, not out of politeness, but as acknowledgement. These were the quiet exchanges that mattered most, the ones that didn't need permission or applause. At the far end of the path where the trail met the neighborhood sidewalk, someone had placed a small laminated sign into the ground near the wildflowers. The ink was slightly faded from rain but still legible. It read, "This trail is named in memory of Jacob Morrow. May we walk differently because of him." No hashtags, no logos, just a name and a truth. Clarice read it and closed her eyes for a moment. She thought of his mother's voice from the phone call a year ago, still shaky but firm, saying, "If you speak for him, I'll know he wasn't forgotten." She thought of the case file, the footnotes scribbled in her own handwriting, and the single line she wrote at the bottom of the summary. Sometimes the echo is the only part people finally hear. She opened her eyes, took a slow breath, and kept walking. Not away from anything, but towards something that was still becoming. The houses came into view one by one, each with its trimmed lawn and quiet porch, and she could almost feel the stillness shifting as she passed, not because she demanded it, but because presence changes things when you refuse to disappear. And so she walked, not as a former judge, not as a symbol, but simply as herself, someone who had carried the truth long enough to know it rarely fits into the spaces people leave for it. But still, she carried it, carefully, purposefully, and with each step, she made room for someone else to follow. The sky was beginning to dim into that soft, late-evening hue where blue folds into gold, and everything seemed suspended for a while, just long enough for the day to exhale. Clarice sat on her porch with a cup of tea in one hand, and her cane resting against the wooden railing beside her, not because she needed it here, but because it had become part of her rhythm, part of how she moved through spaces that hadn't always made room for her. The cicadas had just begun their slow hum, filling the background with that familiar southern chorus of persistence and heat, while a dog barked lazily 2 houses down, followed by the soft slam of a screen door. Life was still happening, ordinary and unchanged in many ways, but beneath it all, something had realigned quietly, like a bone clicking back into place. She leaned back in her chair, letting her eyes wander across the street where porch lights flickered on, one by one, as if answering some unspoken agreement that the day had done its work. And Clarice, for the first time in months, allowed herself to feel what it meant to arrive at the end of something, not in finality, but in clarity. The hearing hadn't issued a verdict yet. The panel was still in deliberation, the case still under review, and she knew better than to expect swift resolution. But the silence had been broken and the record had been set straight, and in a world that often measured progress by noise, she'd learned to measure it by what no longer had to be said. There was a knock at the porch gate, just 2 soft raps, polite and uncertain. Clarice turned her head slowly, and found herself looking at Dean Colburn, dressed in plain clothes, a folder in one hand, his expression stripped of the layers he used to wear like armor. He didn't step forward right away. He waited. As if even now he knew this wasn't his space to enter without invitation. "You came all this way," she said, not with surprise, but with the quiet gravity of someone who had already imagined this moment a dozen times. He nodded. "I wasn't sure if I should." He paused, glanced down at the folder, then back up. "But I needed to try." Clarice gestured gently to the chair across from her. "If you're looking for redemption," she said, "that's not something I hand out. But if you're here to tell the truth, not the version you've rehearsed, but the one you've been avoiding, then sit down." Dean lowered himself into the chair, slowly placing the folder on the table between them, like an offering something delicate and unfinished. He looked older than she remembered, though only a few weeks had passed. His hands fidgeted slightly, brushing the corners of the folder, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The porch creaked beneath them. The cicadas continued their rhythm. "I read the transcript," he said finally. "All of it. The statements, the medical report, your recommendation." He paused, searching for something to anchor his words. "And I realized I never actually looked at Jacob. Not really. I looked at a report, a hoodie, a possibility, not a person." Clarice didn't respond immediately. She watched him speak, not to scrutinize, but to witness, to see if what was surfacing was confession or transformation. "And what do you see now?" she asked, her voice even steady as always. Dean swallowed. A boy who didn't have time to explain he wasn't a threat, and a man who didn't give him the chance. He reached for the folder and opened it slowly, revealing a copy of the photo Jacob's mother had submitted for the inquiry. Jacob at his high school science fair, standing beside a solar panel he'd built from scrap parts, smiling shyly at the camera. The image had circulated in newsrooms and hearings, but now, on this porch, it sat between them like something sacred. "I've carried this around for days," Dean said. "Not to defend myself, just to remind me that he had a face before I made him a statistic." Clarice nodded once. "Then keep carrying it. Let it haunt you. Let it teach you what policies never will." The wind shifted slightly, lifting a loose strand of Clarice's silver hair across her cheek. She tucked it behind her ear, her gaze still fixed on the photo. "What happens next isn't about me or even you," she said. "It's about what gets built from the pieces, what's repaired, what's remembered." Dean sat back, the weight of that truth settling into him without protest. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said quietly. Clarice tilted her head. "That's good," she replied, "because forgiveness is private, but accountability is public, and it's long overdue." They sat in silence for a while, after that just two people on a porch, listening to the evening unfold, like an old story retold, with more honesty this time. Clarice sipped her tea, the heat having faded, but the comfort still lingering. Dean stayed, seated, his hands no longer fidgeting, his posture no longer guarded. When he finally rose to leave, he didn't take the folder. He left it on the table alongside the photo, as if leaving part of the burden where it belonged. "Thank you," he said, not as an apology but as recognition. Clarice didn't stand. She simply nodded her gaze, returning to the soft twilight ahead. "Make it count, Dean," she said. "That's the only thing that matters now." And with that, he walked back through the gate, disappearing into the deepening dusk. Clarice stayed a little longer, watching the last of the sun fold into the trees, her breath slow, steady. There was no parade, no speech, no fanfare. Just an old woman on a porch, a photograph on a table, and the quiet relief of knowing that for once the story didn't end with silence. It ended with truth. And the path it left behind would be there for anyone willing to walk it. What you've just heard isn't just a story about justice, it's a reminder. A reminder that silence is never neutral, and that the truth, no matter how long it's buried, always finds a way back into the light. It teaches us that dignity can walk quietly but powerfully through a world that often forgets its own promises. For those of us who've lived long enough to see how systems work and how they fail, we know this. It takes courage to remember, and even more to speak up when others choose to move on. This story isn't just about a judge or a cop or a boy who deserved more than a headline. It's about all of us, about choosing to see each other, fully refusing to let the noise drown out the names that matter, and standing for something even if your voice trembles. And especially for those of you who've spent a lifetime watching the world try to turn its back, know this: your witness still matters. Your voice still carries weight. Your memory is resistance. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of something we should never forget, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that honor truth, dignity, and the power of standing tall even when the world looks away. Because when we remember together, we rise together. And that at any age is how change begins.